Most people probably saw the headline about Mark Carney landing in Tokyo and signing a strategic partnership with Japan and thought this was just another diplomatic photo moment. Leaders meet, they shake hands, they promise cooperation, and the news cycle moves on. But when you look at the political economy underneath it, something much bigger may be happening. What looks like a routine trade announcement could actually be part of a slow restructuring of how global supply chains are organized and who holds leverage over them. Public reporting suggests the agreement focuses on energy cooperation, critical minerals, advanced technology coordination, and some level of defense collaboration. On the surface, that sounds like a fairly standard strategic partnership between two industrial democracies. Canada has resources, Japan has advanced manufacturing. Put the two together and you get trade. That is the simple version most headlines stop at. But if you zoom out for a moment, the deeper story may have less to do with diplomacy and more to do with leverage in the global economy. For decades, Canada has been structurally tied to the United States market. A huge portion of its exports flow south. That relationship has always given Washington enormous bargaining power. When American administrations threatened tariffs on things like metals, lumber, or energy, Canada historically had limited alternatives because so much of its economic infrastructure was built around that single trade corridor. What appears to be happening now is a deliberate attempt to loosen that dependency. Carney's broader Indo-Pacific outreach, including discussions with countries like India, Australia, and Japan, suggests a strategy of diversification. If Canadian energy, liquefied natural gas, and critical minerals can move reliably across the Pacific rather than primarily across the American border, then the power dynamics change. Tariffs only work as a pressure tool if the target has nowhere else to sell, and that is where the conversation starts to shift from diplomatic symbolism to economic strategy. The industries mentioned in this partnership are not random. Critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements are the backbone of the electrified economy. They sit inside electric vehicles, batteries, renewable infrastructure, and modern electronics. Whoever controls the supply chains around those materials holds enormous influence over the industrial future. What we cannot know from a single announcement alone is how quickly these projects will materialize or how large they will become. But the structural logic is fairly clear. When countries begin locking in long-term supply partnerships around energy and strategic minerals, they are not just trading goods. They are redesigning the architecture of global production itself. If you look at this through the lens of everyday economic security, the stakes become clearer. Canada's resource industries have always been vulnerable to political shocks coming from its largest trading partner. When tariffs or trade disputes emerge, the consequences do not stay in diplomatic circles. They land directly in mining towns, manufacturing communities, and port cities, where people depend on stable export demand to keep their jobs. What a diversification strategy attempts to do is spread that risk. Instead of relying overwhelmingly on one market, a country builds several large buyers across different regions. Japan fits into that picture almost perfectly. It is a massive industrial economy with limited domestic natural resources. Its manufacturing base depends on reliable imports of energy and minerals to keep factories running and supply chains stable. From Japan's perspective, this kind of agreement may be less about expanding trade and more about protecting industrial stability. For years, one of the underlying anxieties in East Asian supply chains has been the concentration of critical mineral processing in China. That concentration creates geopolitical vulnerability. When a single country dominates a resource essential to modern industry, it can potentially use that position as leverage in political disputes. So one plausible motivation behind partnerships like this is simple supply chain resilience. By building a long-term pipeline of energy and minerals from a politically stable country like Canada, Japanese manufacturers reduce the risk that a geopolitical conflict suddenly disrupts their production lines. When you think about how many Japanese jobs depend on automotive manufacturing, electronics, and advanced machinery, the logic becomes very concrete. But these kinds of shifts also reveal how power moves quietly through economic systems. Trade policy debates in the media often focus on personalities or political drama. One leader threatens tariffs, another leader responds, and the story becomes a spectacle of national rivalry. Yet underneath that theatre, governments and corporations are constantly redesigning the physical routes through which resources, energy, and capital move. When those routes change, the balance of power changes with them. A country that once had few export options may suddenly gain several. Another country that relied on privileged access to a neighbour's resources might find that access gradually diluted. None of this happens overnight, and it rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement explaining the full strategy. It unfolds slowly through infrastructure investments, long-term contracts, and supply agreements that quietly reshape the economic landscape. Once you start following the incentives behind these moves, the question becomes very straightforward. Who gains leverage from this new network of partnerships, and who gradually loses it? In a global economy built on supply chains, control over inputs often matters more than control over finished products. The companies assembling vehicles or electronics cannot operate without the steady flow of minerals, metals, and energy that sit at the beginning of the production process. Canada happens to sit on enormous reserves of many of those materials. For decades, that resource base functioned largely as an extension of the North American industrial system. But when a government begins linking those resources to partners across the Indo-Pacific, it potentially transforms them into something closer to geopolitical currency. Energy exports, mineral processing capacity, and shipping infrastructure suddenly become tools of diplomacy as well as sources of profit. That dynamic is especially important when we consider the political environment surrounding trade policy. The mainstream narrative often focuses on tariff battles and political slogans about protecting domestic industry. The assumption is that economic pressure will force trading partners to make concessions because they depend on access to the American market. That logic only works if the dependency remains one-sided. If countries begin building alternative supply networks, the pressure tools start losing effectiveness. A tariff threat becomes less powerful when exporters have multiple destinations for their goods. In that situation, economic confrontation can even backfire, because the targeted country has a stronger incentive to accelerate its diversification strategy. Instead of forcing compliance, pressure pushes allies to deepen cooperation with each other. This is where the consequences move beyond high-level diplomacy and into everyday economic life. Supply chains determine the cost structure of modern industry. If a manufacturing sector suddenly faces uncertainty about its raw materials, companies react in predictable ways. They raise prices, delay investment, or relocate production to areas where inputs are more secure. Workers feel that instability through layoffs, reduced hours, or stagnant wages. At the same time, the places receiving new investment experience a different set of pressures. Resource regions attracting foreign capital often see rapid development, new infrastructure projects, and expanding employment opportunities. But that growth can also produce rising housing costs, strained local services, and widening gaps between those connected to the boom and those left outside it. Economic shifts rarely create simple winners and losers. They rearrange entire local economies. And this is where the media framing often misses the bigger pattern. News coverage tends to focus on the diplomatic symbolism of agreements like this. Leaders sign documents, cameras flash, and the discussion revolves around personalities or political rivalries. But the structural question is usually left unexamined. What matters is not the handshake itself, but the economic architecture being quietly assembled behind it. When countries begin locking in long-term cooperation around energy, minerals, and industrial supply chains, they are effectively redesigning the map of global production. These agreements shape where factories are built, where ports expand, and which workers see new opportunities in their communities. They also shape which governments retain leverage in trade disputes, and which ones discover that their pressure tools no longer work the way they used to. The deeper lesson here is that global capitalism constantly reorganizes itself in response to political risk. Corporations and governments alike look for stability. They look for secure access to resources, predictable partners, and supply routes that cannot easily be interrupted. When a system becomes too dependent on one power center, the incentive to diversify grows stronger with every political shock. So what we may be watching is not simply a diplomatic tour, but a broader shift in how middle powers cooperate with each other. Countries like Canada, Japan, Australia, and India have very different economies, but they share a common interest in reducing vulnerability to both superpower rivalry and supply chain disruption. When those interests align, new economic blocs can start forming almost quietly, through agreements that look technical but carry enormous long-term implications. For ordinary people, the real question is how these structural changes filter down into daily life. Do they produce stable jobs, affordable energy, and resilient supply chains? Or do they simply create new concentrations of wealth and power? That outcome depends less on the agreement itself and more on the policies that follow. Infrastructure investment, labour protections, housing policy, and public oversight will determine whether the benefits reach the broader public or stay concentrated among corporations and investors. So when you see headlines about trade partnerships or strategic agreements, it is worth pausing and asking a different set of questions. What economic dependency is being reduced here? Which supply chain is being rebuilt? And whose leverage in the global system is quietly increasing? If you find yourself noticing these patterns in other stories about trade, energy, or technology, that is exactly the point. These shifts rarely announce themselves clearly at the moment they begin. We usually recognize them only years later when the economic map has already changed. If you want to keep unpacking stories like this and understand how economics, class, and power shape the headlines we see every day, stay engaged with the conversation here. Share your thoughts below and keep asking the deeper questions the news cycle often leaves out.